Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, the Jerusalem psychotherapist. In this week's Torah and Psychology post, Vayigash, we read about the dramatic conversation plea of Yehuda when he's speaking with Yosef, that when Yosef demands that they bring Binyamin, the youngest son, and the only seemingly remaining living child of Rachel, Yehuda responds in saying that it's impossible to bring Binyamin, explaining that Yaakov would in a sense die out of despair and loss if another child of Rachel was taken. Yosef, seemingly as the way Yaakov understands, is being killed, is no longer alive. Binyamin is the remaining child. And the Pasuk uses an interesting and powerful terminology that Yehuda pleads in saying that it's not possible because nafsho kshura benafsho, that the soul, the life of Yaakov is tied up with the life of Binyamin. That his status, his identity, his existence of Yaakov is tied up and dependent on Binyamin, in the sense that we can understand this from a psychological perspective, that nafsho, kshura benafsho, is an expression of an intense, strong relationship between two people. That is what Yehuda was trying to convey to Yosef. So if we take this from a psychological perspective, there's already some sort of a question mark of how we understand this dynamic. That if we look at it from a psychological perspective in terms of relationships, there's somewhat of a grey area of how to understand what is a healthy, adaptive dynamic within a relationship, and what crosses the boundary and moves over to an unhealthy, maladaptive relationship. And certainly this terminology, this phrase of nafsho, kshura benafsho, plays into, from a psychological perspective, the terminology of and the understanding of codependency and fusion within relationships. These are two different terms that are used, although they're not official diagnosis of some sort of pathology, but within relational dynamics, codependency and fusion are often quoted terminologies that are used to understand unhealthy, maladaptive dynamics within relationships. And codependency is one that describes an unequal balance within a relationship. A relationship is defined where one person is the giver and the other is the taker, and that the giver, through reasons of perhaps we can understand of a psychological need, of lack of self-esteem, a lack of confidence, some feeling of that they are lacking an ability to in a way understand and formulate and crystallize their own identity based on their own strengths. They are lacking this, and they require and they latch on to another person and create this connection between themselves and the other person, and by giving to the other person, by creating and in a sense manipulating this relationship in a subconscious way, in an unhealthy way, that the other person becomes the taker and the other person just receives, and they give and they give and they give. It creates this codependency that they need the other person in order to feel that they have a sense of self-worth, that they have value. And therefore there is this establishment of an unhealthy codependent relationship. And in fusion is when we see that the boundaries of the healthy boundaries between two people, an understanding of where one person's existence starts and ends, does not then infiltrate and in a sense move over into another person's identity. Where in fusion the boundaries become blurred, and two identities, two individuals within a system, a family system as well, you could say the two people merge, and two identities merge together and are fused, that one person's values and behavior and identity becomes tied up in a way, merged into the other person, that there's no boundaries, which has created an unhealthy dynamic of overly connected, overly involved, and where it's difficult to make a separation or to see the distinction between two different people. This is a fusion in the relationship. So when we look at codependency and fusion, we see from both of them an intense, strong connection between two people where the relationship is dependent, where the relationship is it's difficult to create a separation between the two identities within the relationship. And if we look at what's being described of nafsho kshura b'nafsho in the pasuk, this can be confused in the way that maybe it's playing into and moving towards codependency, that Yaakov's life is dependent on Binyamin, that there's this unhealthy level of dependency, that Yaakov places too much of an emphasis on Binyamin, or there's a fusion that the interplay between Yaakov and the children of Rachel, of whether it's Yosef, whether it's Binyamin, there's a fusion that Yaakov's identity is tied up with them. Perhaps it presents this impression, but it's important to understand that some of the controversy around using this terminology of fusion, of codependency, which comes up in relational dynamics in families, is that sometimes it's hard to actually define, and it's hard to actually identify whether this is actually normal, healthy, loving actions and behaviors within a relationship. Because we want relationships to be close, we want relationships, certainly in families, to be loving and caring, and that there's an interplay, and there's a connection, and there's a give and take, which can be reciprocal, and therefore there's a certain level of care and also hesitancy to use these terms in terms of in trying to understand and define relationships, because sometimes these expressions are healthy and adaptive depending on the context, depending on the situation, depending on the relationship. So certainly with Yaakov, although the terminology and the wording of nafsho, kshura b'nafsho sounds intense and perhaps in a psychological way can move over to codependency or fusion, I think what the pasuk is telling us and what Yehuda is expressing to Yosef is the level of love. And that is what the Torah is trying to say in a healthy, adaptive way. This is a loving relationship of a father and towards a son. So, although it does give us an interesting insight into the way that relational dynamics can play out and can go in different directions, we get a sensitivity towards understanding the dynamics of relationships and how it can go one way into codependency and into fusion, and into another way into a loving, intense and caring relationship. Have a good Shabbos and keep on.